Scott Eyman. Welcome back to TCM. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Alicia. It's great to be here again.
And I know you are such a familiar name to TCM viewers who, like myself, have been collecting your books for a long time. We're going to talk about your 17th book tonight, which is such an achievement. It's called Charlie Chaplin versus America, When Art, Sex and Politics Collided. And one thing I appreciate about your books is that you tell a life story, you allow us to get to know the subject, but you also have a focus or a kind of framing device. And here with Charlie Chaplin, tell us about using the events that led up to essentially him being banished from the US.
Well, the book opens in September 1952, where he's on the Queen Elizabeth traveling to London to open his film Limelight, accompanied by his wife Una and their four children. And 2 days out of New York, he gets a notice from the INS that his reentry permit has been revoked and he won't be able to come back to America. And the most famous comedian in the world, without question, getting kicked out of his adopted country after almost 40 years, I thought was certainly a story that had never been told in full and needed to be told.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that he wasn't political, or he didn't think of himself as political, but there was that feeling that he was a communist, that he had this sort of secret mission, is very politically subversive in a way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. He was political, but not in any conventional way. Today, he would probably be labeled as a libertarian. In fact, his great bugaboo was nationalism. He thought nationalism was a cancer in any country that allowed itself to be devoured by it, whether it was Nazi Germany or fascist France or fascist Italy. And that was his main problem. He once told a friend that if he became a citizen of any country, it would be Andorra, the smallest and least important place on earth.
Yeah, he never became a US citizen.
He never did.
But certainly important to Hollywood. And the first film we're talking about tonight is Modern Times from 1936. Now, the idea for this came from him returning to America, is that right, after a world tour and sort of seeing the effects of the Depression?
He took an 18-month world tour kind of on the spur of the moment after City Lights opened in 1931. He was going to the premiere in England and decided to just keep going because he hadn't been out of Hollywood in 10 years at this point. But he saw the effects of the Depression all over the world. And he was stunned and appalled. And when he came back to America, end of 32, he realized that the population, the people he saw in California and Oregon and all those places seemed to be moving underwater. They weren't functioning. They were just going through the motions. Their sense of identity had been robbed. Their sense of mission, their sense of employment, their sense of a solid tomorrow that they could access was gone. And in a sense, it impelled him to begin thinking about making his films far more political and socially accessible than they ever had been before.
And this is also a silent film at the time when sound was very well established in Hollywood movies. What was the reaction to his choice?
Well, everybody thought he was crazy. They thought he was crazy in 1931 when he made City Lights as a silent film, because sound had firmly obliterated silent films by that time. But his core feeling was that the tramp needed to remain silent. He gave some thought to having the tramp speak in monosyllables and prepared a script with some dialogue sequences. And he actually seems to have shot one or two scenes. But ultimately, he junked them because the tramp was a universal character representing the disenfranchised, essentially. And if he opened his mouth and spoke, the tramp immediately became English because Chaplin had a soft English accent. And he realized that by accessing the currency of sound, he'd be losing something that was actually far more valuable than dialogue.
Yeah, and there's some sound in the picture, but it's not technically a full sound film.
Right.
And it's also an impressive production. The huge sets, the elaborate sequences, the most impressive of which is the feeding machine sequence.
400 takes to make the feeding machine sequence. It was very complicated, but it's the comic highlight of the film. Part of the problem is you can't see it in the movie, but he's actually maneuvering the tray that is spinning around and pushing the bolts and the nuts into his mouth with his hands. There are gears underneath the feeding machine that he's maneuvering. So getting the timing down was very complicated. Aside from the fact he was a consummate perfectionist because he owned his own studio, he financed his own films out of his own pocket, and he didn't care about the budget. What he cared about was making the film as close to perfect as he could possibly make it.
And that's why it's still impressive to watch today. So let's take a look. Here it is from 1936, Modern Times. Well, Scott Eyman, that was Modern Times, a film produced by, directed by, written by, starring, and music composed by Charlie Chaplin.
Exactly.
With that beautiful theme at the end. Now, what do you think about that ending? Because some people have seen that as sort of Charlie's way of saying goodbye to the tramp, of like sending him off into the sunset.
I think that's probably true. I think he had increasingly felt that the modern world, the modern times, as it were, it was harder for the tramp to be a viable character. And also, he was getting older. He's in his middle 50s, late 50s, actually. He's 57 years old when he's making it. And before, he had made Walking Off into the Sunset not a recurring thing. He'd done it 3 or 4 times over the years. The Circus, The Tramp, and a film he made in 1915. Occasionally, the tramp just has to hit the road because there's no place left for him.
Usually by himself, though.
Always by himself until
Right.
the final scene of Modern Times. As the music, his smile comes up and they hit the road. Finally, the tramp is not alone. Finally, the tramp has a companion. And I think that's exactly the way he dreamt of his life, and that is ultimately the way he lived his life.
And that was Paulette Goddard in her first feature film. She was a discovery made by Charlie Chaplin, right, who knew that she was going to be a star.
Well, he set his cap on making her a star.
Right.
She had made a few small bit parts in Eddie Cantor picture here and there. In the very early 30s, they met in 1932 and became a couple. And he began working with her to turn her into an actress because she had beauty, but she also had personality that shoots through the camera. And that you can't teach.
Yeah.
And she's really startlingly good in the film. And you can't take your eyes off her, just as he couldn't take his eyes off her. So they were a happy couple for 10 years, basically.
And what was the nature of their relationship? Because I know they told people they were married, right?
They
or
did.
people assumed that they were.
People assumed they were, and they did, in fact, say that they were married by a ship's captain somewhere in the Orient. They weren't sure where. In fact, there's no marriage certificate. But basically, the marriage story was a sop because Goddard was one of the finalists to play Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. But women's clubs, especially in the South, were so connected to Gone with the Wind and the saga of Scarlett O'Hara and the idea of female empowerment that they were very uncomfortable with the idea of an unmarried woman living in sin with a famous comedian getting the part. Now, of course, Selznick ended up hiring Vivian Leigh, who was also living with Laurence Olivier at the time, to whom she was not married. But nobody particularly knew outside of Hollywood that Vivian Leigh and Laurence Olivier were lovers.
Right.
Whereas everybody knew that Chaplin and Paulette Goddard were supposedly married.
Yeah, she's certainly beautiful in this film, Paulette. And this movie, Modern Times, was a success, wasn't it?
It did extremely well in America, made a nice profit. And most importantly, I think it begins to evince his concern for being something more than just a comedian, touching upon the real chaos that was affecting people's lives.
And something you said in your book, which I thought was really interesting, was talking about the ways in which the tools have become more important than the humans, and how may Chaplin, what would have Chaplin thought of our smartphones and AI and everything we're dealing with now?
Exactly. I'm sure he would have had a great deal of fun with that. Horrified fun, but fun nonetheless.
Well, Scott Eyman, thank you so much for being with me here on TCM tonight.
Thank you, Alicia.
And we have another film coming up next where Chaplin evolved even more into talking about real issues that was happening in the world. So join us after the break for The Great Dictator. Scott Eyman, so nice to have you back with me on TCM.
Thank you so much, Alicia.
And we're talking about your new book. It's called Charlie Chaplin versus America, When Art, Sex and Politics Collided. And before we get too much into our next movie, The Great Dictator, it's interesting to think about the ways in which Charlie Chaplin was misconstrued throughout his career, even that people, including the Nazis, thought that he was Jewish.
Right. Well, that actually stemmed from a book published in the end of the 1920s by a Jewish group that said his family name was actually Thonstein, and they'd emigrated someplace from Galicia into London. Not true. He wasn't Jewish, but he almost never denied being Jewish because he thought it gave aid and comfort to anti-Semites, emphatically including Nazi Germany.
Yeah, and he, of course, saw the resemblance between the tramp and Adolf Hitler with the mustache. And the idea for the great dictator came partly from Alexander Korda. Is that right?
Right. Other people had noticed the odd resemblance, the same toothbrush mustache. But the actual idea, Chaplin said, came from Alexander Korda, who was one of the partners in United Artists, the company that Chaplin co-founded with Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith. And Korda said that you could do a mistaken identity story, you know, with the tramp and a dictator who just happens to look a little bit like Adolf Hitler. And that got Chaplin thinking.
And nobody wanted him to make this movie. I mean, at this time, America was isolationist.
Completely. The only two people who wanted the movie made were Charlie Chaplin and Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, of course, was the president. And Roosevelt, Chaplin, and Winston Churchill were three of the few people who understood that you don't negotiate with a mad dog and you don't argue with a mad dog. You have to put the mad dog down. Everybody else thought that Hitler could be adeptly handled. No, he couldn't be adeptly handled. But, of course, the Nazis were desperate to prevent the film. They had a Los Angeles consulate, a man named George Gissling, who basically was in charge of putting the arm on anybody in Hollywood that made anti-Nazi films and kind of making veiled bureaucratic threats on the order of, nice little industry you got here, shame if anything happened to it.
And one thing that Chaplin said was that the powerful can always be made ridiculous.
Right.
Like he saw that it could be powerful to make fun of such a horrible leader.
Right. Ridicule. Actually, he makes Hitler out to be even more ridiculous than he actually was. You know, the spitting, the ranting, the raving, the endless insecurity that has to be fed all the time by the underlings. He understood the authoritarian mindset on a cellular level.
And this was Chaplin's first sound film. And so we hear him speak in two very different accents as the two characters.
Right. He does a kind of comic guttural German double talk as Hinkle, Adenoid Hinkle, when Hinkle's raving to the public. And as the Jewish barber, he speaks the way he was going to speak in modern times. He doesn't say much, monosyllables, a brief sentence here and there, but he doesn't really articulate a lot of ideas or thoughts as the Jewish barber until the very end.
And the thing that surprises me about this film for his first sound film is that the dialogue is really sophisticated, as well as it being very physically funny. And there's that great globe ballet dance sequence.
That derives from a bit he'd done. It was one of his party bits that he would do to loosen the crowd up at a party, and also assuage his own social insecurity. He was very socially uncomfortable, so he, like most comedians, would do bits to you know, make everybody think, oh, he's really like that. Actually, he was kind of moody most of the time, but he felt the need to entertain, and the business with the globe, posing with the globe like a Greek statue, was a bit he did at Pick Fair and was photographed in 1928 or 1929. So he kind of just developed it as something a megalomaniac would do when he was alone and no one was watching him.
It's very elegant, too.
Very elegant and very beautiful, and done to Wagner, of all people.
Well, let's take a look. Here it is from 1940, The Great Dictator. You know, Scott, Eyman, watching The Great Dictator, every time I remain impressed at that final speech. And this is not really Chaplin as the barber, it's sort of Chaplin as Chaplin, or he changes throughout the speech.
When he cuts to the close-up, when he begins the speech, it's kind of daring because he doesn't rip the mustache off. But what he does do is suddenly you see his age. You can see the lines in his face. You can see he's 51 years old, 52 years old at this point, and he's not a young man anymore. And the way he levels his head down and stares at the lens, he's telling you that this is not a performance, this is him. This is what he really feels and thinks. You know, it goes far beyond the character's basic inability to speak, which has been established throughout the picture. You know, he's very inarticulate, the Jewish barber. And suddenly Chaplin pulls out his baseball bat and starts swinging at what this movie's really about and what he's really about.
Yeah, this is the type of scene that's been widely shared on the internet, even by people who've never actually seen the movie itself. What was the reaction like at the time to this scene, to him actually speaking as himself?
Well, it was partially some people felt that he had made an aesthetic mistake by belaboring the audience with agitprop. Other people said, no, this is something the film has been leading up to for its entire running time. And as Chaplin said, they had their fun, didn't they? Didn't I make them laugh? Didn't I dazzle them when they needed to be dazzled? Well, it's time for them to hear what I really think, you know? And I think he felt he'd earned the right after all these years to say what he really felt about National Socialism and freedom and the terrible trials that were being visited upon the people of Europe. Some people applauded it. It was widely reprinted as a speech. Franklin Roosevelt asked him to repeat it at the third inauguration for Roosevelt, and he did. So there was a very divided response to the speech. I think it's magnificent. Aesthetically, you can argue pro and con. Emotionally, I fail to see how you can really have much negative feelings about it.
Yeah, bold speech and a bold film for the times.
Totally.
And it did very well commercially and critically.
It was a huge hit, which shocked everybody. Because, as I said, the only people that really wanted it made were Franklin Roosevelt and Chaplin. The Hollywood columnists thought he had taken leave of his senses. Hedda Hopper said it would never be shown because Hitler was not funny, no laughing matter, and how could you possibly make a comedy about someone like this? No, it was a huge hit, ran for 12 weeks in New York and had lengthy runs everywhere in the world, especially considering the fact that Europe was completely closed off for it except for England.
Yep.
The only place it played in Europe was England, really. Even parts of South America didn't see it. So a lot of the revenue from the film actually came after World War II. But no, it was a huge financial success. And once again, the fact that Chaplin dared to violate what everybody else said was common sense turned out to be a very good business move, not that he cared.
Yeah, and you mentioned Hedda Hopper. She really disliked Chaplin. She was always ready to criticize his movies and then became quite outspoken against him.
She loathed him for his politics. She was extremely conservative, and she was one of the founders of the Motion Picture Alliance, which started the Hollywood blacklist in 1947. And she also had a serious problem with his affection for relationships with younger women, because she herself had been a younger woman who she felt had been taken advantage of by an older man, her first husband, DeWolf Hopper, the father of her son, William Hopper, who became a character actor later on in Perry Mason and other shows. And he had left her high and dry, DeWolf Hopper. So she kind of empathized with some of the women that she felt Chaplin had taken advantage of. So her rage against Chaplin was partly political and partly sexual.
Yeah. Well, Scott Eyman, thank you so much for being with me on TCM tonight.
Thank you, Alicia.
And we have one more film to talk about coming up after the break. It's from 1947 and it's called Monsieur Verdoux. And I'm back with Scott Eyman, the author of the new book, Charlie Chaplin versus America, When Art, Sex and Politics Collided. It's coming out next week. And this book really looks at the events that led up to Charlie Chaplin being banished from the US. So we're about to talk about Monsieur Verdoux from 1947. So by the 1940s, what had happened in Charlie Chaplin's life?
Well, during World War II, first he made The Great Dictator, which had antagonized a great portion of the American public that was isolationist. Early in the war, the federal government charged him with violating the Mann Act, transporting a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. He was acquitted after the jury deliberated for an hour, and then he had a paternity suit. And a blood test proved that he wasn't the father of the child, and he lost the case anyway, because public opinion was beginning to turn against him because of the involvement with a younger woman. She was 23 and he was 53 or 54 at the time. After the war, the spirit of the country began a slow shift from we're all in this together to we're not all in this together. And everybody began taking sides, and the great period of reaction began, the Hollywood blacklist, among other things, the McCarthy era a few years later. And Chaplin was caught in this scissor move between essentially politicians and conservative politicians and the right-wing press. And the FBI began feeding disinformation in most cases and twisted information in other cases to favored columnists like Hedda Hopper and Ed Sullivan and Walter Winchell and Westbrook Pegler, and there were others. And the interesting thing about the period, the extent to which the Hollywood community went silent. The Hollywood 10 had defenders. They had the Committee for the First Amendment, a group of very famous stars and directors who protested what was happening to the Hollywood 10. Chaplin had precisely three people who stood up for him in public: Cary Grant, William Wyler, and Sam Goldwyn. That was it. Everybody else just went into their caves and didn't open their mouth. So he was an exposed target.
Yeah, then he chose to make Monsieur Verdoux, which was a very divisive film.
Very.
The idea for this movie came from Orson Welles, but Chaplin didn't want to be directed by Welles.
No, he and Orson Welles were never comfortable with each other, possibly because they both had egos the size of the Himalayas. But Welles had this idea of using Chaplin as a performer to play the story of the French mass killer Landru. And it hadn't occurred to Chaplin, but he was intrigued by the idea, so he bought the idea from Welles for $5,000 and agreed to give him screen credit. In later years, Welles said he actually, it wasn't just an idea, he gave him a complete shooting script. But no shooting script has ever turned up in any of Orson Welles' papers or any of Chaplin's papers. In any case, it's a comedy, sort of, about a guy who's rendered unemployed by the Great Depression, who decides the only way to support his wife and child is by marrying a succession of deeply unpleasant women and killing them for their money. The film, in a sense, if you want to read it that way, confirms his reputation by 1947 as a misogynist.
It's also a very different character to the Tramp and, an unlikable character. And it's interesting that Charlie Chaplin didn't actually want to reveal too much about the content of the movie before it came out.
No.
So audiences were quite shocked by what they saw.
And in a sense, it's a 180. An overt 180 away from the Tramp, who is idealistic and he can be aggressive, but only if pressed first. And here is this basically misogynist, pathological killer who, when he's caught, blames society.
Yeah.
It was reviled at the time and was a fast failure, and Chaplin felt wounded by it because he'd never had a flop before. Over 30 years in the movie business, 35 years in the movie business, he'd never had a flop. And here was his first flop at a time when he's 58 years old and successful domestically. He and his wife were extremely happy and their children were growing and everything. But the question is, once he decided to not be the Tramp anymore, who was he going to be?
Yeah.
What does Charlie Chaplin do now? And Verdoux was clearly an indication that his parameters were more limited than he might have thought they were.
So let's watch. Here he is, Charlie Chaplin from 1947 in Monsieur Verdoux. Well, Scott Eyman, that was Monsieur Verdoux. That was a commercial flop for Charlie Chaplin. How did he react to that film not doing so well?
He was wounded. It was a new experience for him and not a pleasant experience. No filmmaker likes to, have a failure rubbed in their face. And he felt he'd been unfairly maligned, and he felt the film had been unfairly maligned. Years later, he actually kind of revised his opinion. He said, movies are an emotional business. Movies appeal to the emotions. If the audience rejects a movie, that's on me. That means I have failed. But Verdoux, he talked less about it as he got older.
Right.
Because I think at the end of his life, he felt it was an aesthetic mistake, that he had to get out of his system. And he did get out of his system, because for the last film he made in America, he made a love story. Limelight is essentially a story of Charlie and Una reformatted in dramatic form. An older comedian who's afraid of losing his audience and is in fact losing his audience, and a younger woman who's seeking a safe place and finds it with this older man. Together, they find happiness for a while.
Well, your new book is called Charlie Chaplin versus America, When Art, Sex and Politics Collided. It's out next week. And I'm curious, just for you, as someone who has watched all of Charlie Chaplin's movies and now done a lot of research into his life, did your personal opinions or feelings towards Chaplin change throughout your writing process?
I got an increased respect for his stalwart character, his refusal to bend, let alone break. A lot of people would have crumbled under the kind of relentless pounding that he took for more than a decade. Or they would have shut up, or they would have just hidden in their house and not gone out. He lived his life. He played tennis. He had friends over the house. He went out. He donated money to the Henry Wallace campaign in 1948. And hardly anybody except Katharine Hepburn donated money to the Henry Wallace campaign in 1948. And he raised a huge family of 8 children and had a successful, nurturing, happy marriage. So in one sense, the latter portion of his life is creatively disappointing, but in a personal sense, it's possibly something he took as much pride in as he took in his work.
Well, Scott Eyman, congratulations on the book, and thank you so much for joining me on TCM tonight.
Thank you, Alicia.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, and that's it for us. But make sure you keep watching TCM now, because coming up is another classic film, and as always, it is uncut and commercial free.